Expecting a few more students to arrive, and if that's okay, we'll wait for a minute too.
Yep.
That's fine.
Thanks. I still don't see Janik, so I propose that we go ahead and get started. I'm Müjdat Çetin. I'd like to welcome you all to today's lecture on augmented and virtual reality. This lecture series is organized by the Gergen Institute for Data Science and River Campus Libraries at the University of Rochester, as supported by the National Science Foundation as part of our PhD training program on augmented and virtual reality. Today, we are very pleased to have Professor Anand Santhanam. Professor Santhanam is an assistant professor with the Department of Radiation Oncology at the University of California, Los Angeles, and also is a founder, director, and an advisor for SAG-ANIM. Dr. Santhanam has worked on biomedical modeling of lungs since 2002 for different applications, ranging from computer animation, virtual reality, rehabilitation, tissue engineering, to radiation oncology. His PhD dissertation was focused on developing high-performance computing-based algorithms for physics and physiology-based 3D lung dynamics using state-of-the-art graphics processing units. He was principal investigator for the James and Esther King 2008-10 Team Science Project grant for $1 million in collaboration with the MD Anderson Cancer Center Orlando, which focused on incorporating 3D biomechanical lung dynamic models for assisting in the treatment efficacy of lung radiotherapy. His research focus is on developing algorithms for 3D and 4D image processing-based lung registration, lung anatomy, deformation modeling, lung deformation-based elasticity estimation, tumor dosimetry, and lung deformation-based radiotherapy evaluation. He has published several journal papers in the field of biomechanical organ modeling. With that, I will pass the mic on to Anand for his presentation.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Anand Santhanam from LA. For everyone, it's a beautiful weather down here. So my talk today is focused on enabling virtual and augmented reality systems, including, oh, there's Janik. Hey, Janik. So within the given capacity of different things that we have done, I would be focusing primarily on one of the projects that we did that was very close to enabling VAR systems in a clinic. Give me one second. Janik had earlier mentioned me that it might be interesting to some people in terms of how I got into this. My background is not specifically bio or medicine. It's purely computer science. In fact, if you look into my schooling, I did my Bachelor of Engineering in computer science from a very small college called Bharat Engineering College, Bharat Institute of Science and Technology. It is now a university by itself, but it's a very small college. It was very close to my home, so my parents thought it's nice. He can do his undergrad close by. He will never leave the city. Turns out I never came back. I did my master's at the University of Texas, Dallas. We did a lot of focus on programming routers and switches and telecom industry and so on. So we did a lot of embedded system programming. And when I started my doctorate in computer science, the initial idea was to use all this programming to see if we can come up with better networks. That wasn't very interesting to me after a few months. And then we switched slowly my expertise into programming gaming systems for specific graphics problems. And they were quite related because they both were embedded systems. And after some hands-on to it, it didn't interest me. For any graduate student, it's very important what motivates you. And they were motivating at that time. And then I think in August 2002, I had a chance to meet Dr. Roland, and she was explaining the augmented reality project, and immediately clicked. It's like, that is the thing that we have to do. And her initial problem that she gave me was to see if we can get a 3D lung, animate, put it in an AR, use it for treatment guidance. And I think we came up pretty quickly for a solution within like 6 to 9 months. And I thought everything is done. That wasn't the case. From a clinical perspective, for validating, collecting data, and doing everything, it took another interesting 3 years. And we were at that time asking for 4D imaging, and turns out 4D lung was very early stage of development. So it took us a while to get the data and do the validation. And it turned out to be a very useful project. And while doing this, we had a chance to get in touch with the MD Anderson Cancer Center. And they looked at the modeling work that we did, and they immediately thought that this is very useful for cancer treatment. And that's how they gave me a postdoc in association with UCF. And then we started focusing on how tumor moves inside the lung and how it can be visualized and so on. And this was impressive for Florida Department of Health, and they gave us a big grant. So that then I became a faculty, and that's kind of how I got into cancer treatment, and so on. A good caveat is I did schooling when I did my middle school. Sundar Pichai was my senior, so that's a big move. You know. This is a small throwback picture all the way 15 years ago. If you can spot Janik, you get some credits. My current UCLA team, I work very closely with my chair, Dr. Daniel Lowe. He's an expert in lung imaging, and we work closely on mini grants, and we co-mentor 3 students right now. All of them are working on different parts of lung imaging, lung modeling, and lung visualization related problems. We have some very interesting collaborators who are looking into lung surgery usage, how we can use lung models, and as well as visualize, come up with a better treatment plan, do better patient selection. Those are the criteria that we're working with. Dr. Golden is specifically focused on lung volume reduction surgeries and implants that goes inside the lung. Igor Berjaktarevic is another professor, doctor, who's working on lobectomy and LVRS simulations and airflow studies with Dr. Ilek Busi. And we have had 4 graduate students in the past. All of them are doing good. That's kind of where we are. I know that all the students have been, talking a lot about VAR application domains. So it's pretty obvious for everyone that, okay, there is a lot of applications in entertainment, theme parks, digital gaming, consumer design. You can come up with better design by better visualization. That's the theory. Engineering designs and manufacturing. I'm sure you heard the talk from Califitopiastis, where VAR systems are very useful in those scenarios, and the training and in terms of medical, technical, military, etc. So we want to focus mainly on the clinical part. VAR systems are very effective in visualizing, simple simulations. Earlier on, these surgical simulations were very crude in terms of visualization, what they can get, but they get the job done of introducing the trainee for what he has to do. And with technologies like HoloLens, Magic Leap, HTC Vive, better visualizations are coming up every day. And it enables the clinicians to look into higher and higher detail of what the procedure he is going to do and what, where he is going to cut and so on. Um, VAR in medical training is sort of a story that we started with in back in 2006. We started with the real-time stereoscopic visualization of 3D lung geometry and dynamics as the perfect application, looking into airflow patterns, specific breathing conditions, and the applications were helping with endotracheal intubation and pneumothorax. And with the recent COVID pandemic, there are like many millions of patients who have gone through these endotracheal intubations, and this application has had a lot of value as of last year. VAR is a very good platform for visualizing organ dynamics, whether it is simply looking at the lung anatomy, doing its dynamics, or getting superimposed on top of a mannequin and looking into it very realistically. These are very critical applications from a training perspective, and these are work that has been done for a long time. However, if you look into radiotherapy, this is a therapy field. So let me introduce how this actually works. Radiotherapy is all about sending very highly energized particles, and they call it as a radiation dose, through the body, very specifically targeting with millimeter precision where the tumor is, where different organs are. There is a lot of care that is given in terms of knowing where the tumor is, how much dose the tumor actually gets, and how much dose the surrounding organs can get, surrounding glands can get, and everything can affect the patient quality of life and the ultimate outcome. The therapy, the way it is given, gives a role for VAR in a sense that when there is a big treatment room where we have these high energy gantries with we also call it as linear accelerators, and with a treatment couch where the patient is positioned. Once the patient gets positioned, the room doors get closed, and the therapy goes outside the room. Nobody is inside the room at the time, and first does an imaging of where the patient is, where the internal organs are, and so on, and some correction in terms of the treatment couch is done. And then once the treatment starts, there is nobody inside the room. So the treatment completes by itself. And once the treatment is delivered, the doors open, and then the therapist goes inside and gets the patient out. So that's kind of where we see a lot of applications for VAR systems, because we can give a virtual presence inside the room when the treatment is actually happening. If you look into VAR in a radiotherapy setup, it is not very widely used currently. There are a couple of applications that are out there, that are not yet FDA approved for training and so on. I can see only one application with VAR that has been currently FDA approved. So there are a lot of surgical simulators with VAR guidance that are occasionally used in a research and a training setup. What we want to focus on, how do we bring it for daily workflow? And a key limitation to actually do that is transitioning the patient anatomy that is acquired at the planning stage to the anatomy on the treatment couch. And this is a big problem, because when the patient is acquired, depending upon how the patient is positioned, we have subtle changes in the patient anatomy. And when the treatment happens, we need sub-millimeter or even close to millimeter precision, and we cannot get it. And if we want to show this data using a VAR system for therapeutic setup, we need to make sure that we can get that anatomy accurately. So today's talk, I want to quickly go through how do we integrate patient imaging that is acquired during the planning with the patient on the treatment couch, and how are scenarios where we have overlaid and visualized critical deductive information, and we'll go through what is the deductive information from images and how they can be overlaid. Treatment space is basically the entire treatment room. That includes the gantry, the couch, the entire room where the additional panels that are sitting there, even wires dangling in this treatment room, and so on. So first, to get it, we started employing 3D camera guided setups. We have analytics and algorithms that we coupled with it for tracking what is happening inside the radiation treatment room. And the specific application is, number one, is patient safety. Patient safety is a big deal. Once in a while, something may go wrong inside the room. This may not happen every day, but when it happens, it's quite dangerous for the patient. So we take extreme care to make sure we can track those events and give a visualization. And remote teaching is another application, so that we can teach trainees how the patient is positioned, what is he doing, and so on. And to come up with this task, there are several specific tasks involved. System design, how do we build these 3D cameras? How do we calibrate the cameras? I know there are a lot of optics people who have done this. And how do we machine learn so that we can identify which object it is actually looking into? And specifically, how do we do clinical integration, in a sense that integrate with the clinical area systems, where we know which patient is on the couch, where is he supposed to get treated, is he getting treated at the same location, is it different from yesterday, and so on. And development of clinical workflows, so that we can alert the clinician that if something is wrong, it goes all the way. This setup by itself is simple. So basically, you have multiple 3D cameras that are put all over the patient. Some are looking into patient's head, some are looking into patient's body, neck, leg, and entire zone. And every camera simultaneously acquires, and we do a lot of noise cancellation to make sure there are no artifacts and so on. And here is a look at where it is right now in the clinic. So we have 6 cameras that are mounted all over the ceiling. And you see a lot of additional cameras that are typically used for the treatment itself. And there are F-spot X-rays, there are Exactra cameras, there are Align RT cameras, and all of them do different tasks. And in addition to them, we were able to install multiple Kinect cameras and get the system going. And this is a close look that 2 cameras that are looking directly onto the patient, with 3 additional cameras doing the clinical task also. So there are really large number of cameras put into place. Now, we want to emulate the same system in the lab. So good part of being a professor is I can try to build the same system in the lab. So we basically rebuilt the entire camera system in a small lab room. We built the assembly, we built all the connecting rods and assembles, and we again came up with the same system so that we can emulate what is actually happening in the treatment room in a lab setup. The computing setup is quite complicated. If you look into the 3D camera, it generates somewhere close to 8 to 16 MB of data per half a second. So every second it's dumping somewhere close to 32 MB of data, and that's one camera. And so you have 6 cameras, so it generates a lot of data. So we cannot directly use the Ethernet connectivity. So we had to use specific USB connections. And we all know that the USB connections cannot go along. And in the radiation therapy setup, we have radiation going all over the place. And if we were to place the computer in the wrong place, the computer will get fried up, right? So we had to closely work with the hospital to make sure we can find spots where there is almost no radiation, where we can keep the computers. The NUC boxes were used so that these are really small computers that has USB 2.0 connectivity, and it connects directly to the camera. And we had, specific places above the roof that we kept. And, we worked with the engineering team very closely to actually get this done. And once the NUC boxes connect all the data sets, they have a specific high-speed internet through which they push all the data into the main server. The main server then stitches all the data and comes up with an integrated image. Why multiple cameras? Occlusion is the main problem. So when a 3D camera looks into some region, you may have a major occlusion that's missing a lot of data. But when you have multiple cameras, you can see that you can collect or the entire patient anatomy or the entire desk quite accurately, and that gives you the ability to look into the whole system as an integrated one. This is when all the 6 cameras are working. This is what basically we call as a point cloud. So once you register the individual fractional pixels, you get this integrated system. You have dust of points that are just noise, but you can get the treatment system, where the table is, where the gantry is, whether the side panels are open or not, and all those activities. And you can also see that once the gantry starts moving, it generates new points, it generates new polygons and everything. And although all those data sets need to be maintained and integrated in real time and so on. And so that's the task. So now we get the information. This is just a simple qualitative analysis. We have the name variant. Variant is a big player in radiotherapy. We have the name variant that is acquired using 2 cameras. On the right side, we have color-coded image of which camera gives which information. And once you put it together, you get a good, you can still read the name variant. So that's a good indicator that the registration is doing fine. The generating the 3D mesh is quite a complicated problem. And that's one thing is because we generate a really large point cloud, and we generate a large point cloud, twice every 30 seconds. So that's a lot of meshing that needs to happen in real time. The patient face is obviously meshed in order to protect the identity, as well as, it's a head and neck patient. But it gives you a picture of what is actually happening. Some of the clinical applications that we initially focused is treatment space recording. Why is this important? Treatment space recording enables someone to go back in time and check to see what happened to a specific patient. So this is a very interesting VAR problem, in a sense that whenever some treatment goes wrong, whenever there is a radiation event that happens, the software gives the ability to go and say, what happened to that patient? Can we look into it? Was that a mistake, or was there something unexpected happened? It gives the ability to look into it, and it's a 3D snapshot of the 3D treatment space that is acquired and saved every once in 30 seconds. So that keeps automatically updating, and data can be retrospectively viewed in VAR systems so that you can verify what happened. And data can also be used for machine learning the treatment space, because it gives you all the information in terms of gantry and so on. The second problem we addressed is collision detection. Collision is scenarios when some unexpected object is placed in the room and the gantry moves and gets closer to that patient, and it may be hitting the object, or the object may be hitting the patient, or things like that may be happening. Sometimes when the patient is wrongly positioned, the gantry gets very close to the patient and it may even hit them. So all these events, they may not happen every day, but when it happens, it becomes a very complicated issue. So these can be avoided using the system. So the first thing that we did is trying to track the key features in the treatment room. So one of the things that we do is we use a 3D feature detection using a GPU-based graph cut algorithm. So the graph cut algorithm basically works by creating a Gaussian mixture model that has a Markov random field setup, and it identifies which is foreground, which is background, which is the object that we want to track, which is the one that we don't want to track, and he selects the region. So here the image, everything is color coded to purple or violet, and then the tracked object is effectively selected and tracked over the place. And there is a camshift based 3D tracking algorithm that tracks where this specific feature is moving in the space. So here is a small video. For example, you have the mannequin, Bob. He has been with me for the last 20 years, I think. And this object, whatever small subtle movement is done, it is automatically tracked, and we keep in mind where this object is moving, and how fast it is moving. So although the camera is observing everything behind it, we clearly take it out and show that, okay, this is the exact object that we are tracking, and we go from there. So there are scenarios where, this is a simple example where we have the mannequin and a small box, and each of them are identified separately by 3 cameras in the treatment room, and they are integrated to form a single box, and they keep noting that, okay, we don't want these 2 guys to be very close. And when they get beyond a threshold, it automatically starts to alert the system. And it's a very simple example. So here is a scenario where we just track the head of the mannequin, and we have a small box that is on the table, and we keep tracking where these 2 objects are in the treatment space. And the postdoc is basically simulating the object slowly coming closer and closer and closer. And I can just go, like, when it gets really close, and the system starts to alert the therapist, or in this case the postdoc, that, hey, you're very close, we need to do something. So These are tracking algorithms that we have employed in place. Deep learning is a very essential part in the treatment. I know you guys are all data science folks. And we use the camera system to also come up with an intelligent framework that understands how the gantry looks from different angles, how the couch looks from a different angle, how the patient looks, with and without the mobilization masks, and so on. And one of the problems that we always deal with is daily positioning shifts. Since the treatment happens for like 30 days or 35 days, we need to make sure that the patient is exactly positioned in the same place as of yesterday. There could be a small shift as of yesterday. Every day there could be a small shift. So here in this case, we have a reference position, and that's where the object is supposed to keep. The mannequin is supposed to be placed, and there is a small shift that we can see because the mannequin is now positioned in a different location, and it gives a correction as to which direction it has to move and where it is moving and so on. So this is a very essential problem. So from a clinical perspective, here is we have a volunteer who's on the treatment couch, and we have two phases overlap. One is the reference phase as where the patient was supposed to be, or where the volunteer was supposed to be, and where he is placed as of now, simulated by the therapist. So subtle changes in where the person is basically positioned. So in this case, instead of getting treated on the left lung, the patient is positioned, maybe positioned to be treated on the right lung, which is a wrong side scenario. And so these things can be automatically identified by the treatment space setup. Wrong immobilization mask when, instead of patient A's immobilization mask, when patient B's immobilization mask is put in, it's not the right setup, and that again causes all kinds of issues in the delivery, and all those things are identified automatically by the system. Virtual reality based training. So we acquire the patient anatomy, we acquire some of the components in the treatment room. However, we also have huge CAD models from the vendor itself in terms of how the treatment couch looks, the details of which nut or which bolt can be adjusted, how which screws can be unlocked, how can we move it, and so on. So there is a lot of interesting aspect that we can do in terms of merging the two data sets. So the detail of what the cameras acquire versus what the CAD model can be, what the CAD model actually is, and we can integrate them to get a much better information. So we initially used a HTC Vive based setup with all our servers doing the number crunching and data storage and so on. Here is Dr. Yugang Min, coming up with a visualization, and visualization was initially very crude, but it gives, since we had a lot of data, we were able to see the patient for where we are. Augmenting CT information into the treatment space. This was a very essential problem. Now that we know we can measure what is happening in the treatment space, can we throw in the CT data of the patient onto the mannequin itself or onto the patient itself and see where the patient is and where the anatomy is, so on. And so that becomes now the focus of what is happening. Now we can acquire the treatment space. Now, what do we do with the actual imaging data? So from, the key part of integrating the data is it is going to be multimodal information. What does it mean by multimodal information? In the case of a treatment, the patients sometimes have a CT, they always have a CT, and sometimes they get PET, sometimes they get 4D imaging, and all those are additional information. They all needs to be integrated into one single setup that can be visualized, that can be overlaid so that somebody can visualize it accurately. And keep in mind that any error more than a millimeter is considered to be not accurate. And there are also information in terms of multi-scale image integration. So when biopsies are acquired for a tumor, we can integrate those information directly onto the CT so that they know exactly where the tissue was biopsied and how does it integrate with the rest of the body. And integrating images that provide complementary information. So you have, for example, histology, you have a big representation of where the tumor is, and CT after histology shows a different story. And all these things are very useful. And the same way, when you look into PET and CT, they tell different stories, and integrating these stories is very essential so that we provide the best visualization. And so, if you want to spare, facilitate treatment plans that can spare normal tissues effectively, we need to take a lot of care in making sure we don't overdose normal tissues and we deliver precise dose to the tumor. And so we have to account for dynamic posture changes in the patient and also physiological changes. By physiological changes, that means weight loss, body fat reduction, water loss, and all these things happen to cancer patients. So if you have cancer survivors in the family, everybody knows that when the treatment goes through, the patient loses a lot of weight. That could be like 20, 30 pounds within a month or so. So we need to account for all those events in order to come up with a good visualization. So the way we do it is biomechanical models can be developed from the macro scale image data. So CT scales, CT images, and they can be integrated with other macro scale images as well as micro images. So why is it important? You can say that on the left side, we have the image acquired during the planning, and on the right side, we have the image acquired during the treatment. You can see that there are subtle posture changes that happens from one day to another, or planning day to the day one. And this happens a lot. And we need to keep in mind that that could introduce a very significant error from a radiotherapy perspective. Similarly, body weight loss, the little chin, all the fat loss happening in the chin, and things, basically shrinking and so on, needs to be accounted for. So the way we do it is we call it the avatars. Basically, these are biomechanical models, and we first acquire the CT image that is acquired for every patient. We then manually sit and do on a organ contouring. This is done for every radiotherapy patient, where we look into mark all the glands where the tumor is, cord, and all other sensitive organs. And we then look into these contour dotted files. We generate filled volumes out of it, so that we first connect all the dots, and then we start to look into which voxels are inside the contour, which are outside the contour. We need to make sure, sometimes we have these scenarios where we have a big gaping hole in the middle. So we need to know which one is inside and which one is outside, and then start assembling a finite element model organ by organ slowly by every contour. And so that you create the skeletal structures separately, and then you look into individual structures and so on. And finally apply simple thresholds to any unassigned elements that we don't know if it's a fat or water tissue. We need to definitely account for that. Once you do it using finite element techniques, you can then take a normal position. You can simulate what happens when the neck is rotated, what happens when there's fat loss, what are the different stress patterns, strain patterns that are actually happening inside, and how it may affect where the tissue is getting pulled or crushed and so on. And all those things can be modeled. So, and they all need to happen in almost real time because the patient is on the couch. So we use a GPU based setup to actually look into how this can be modeled. So here is a simple example of avatar just rotating its neck, and when it flexes, different force maps that gets generated that shows how these force maps are going in, and where there is constriction, where there is expansion, and what happens when the neck is rotated, and so on. The additional problem that we have is when the tumor starts to shrink. So here is a simple walkthrough inside the anatomy. So here's a finite element model. So you may not see a lot of anatomical detail, but you see the mesh. And the blue region represents the tumor or the target volume. And once it starts to shrink, it is pulling this nearby muscles along. So you can see the stress map that is on the rest of the anatomy just because the tumor is actually shrinking. So it changes the anatomy from one day to another also. And just force maps and details are there that shows that anatomical changes during weight loss and during even when the tumor starts to shrink is quite heavy. So the first thing that we have to worry about is how do we take into account of the hinge constraint modeling. So how do we worry about the different neck postures? We acquire both using these treatment cameras as well as like the onboard imaging, just so that we can figure out where the neck position is. and then we update the biomechanical model to get to the same neck position, get to the same head position, and so on, and then generate, warp or deform the planning data so that we can actually show it on overlap on top of it. So, you have this simple positions like, chin up and rotated. You can see these muscles that are getting flexed in different regions. They bend and they move and they get twisted in different ways. And these are important details that we will have to show and during visualization so that they can understand, okay, these are the anatomical changes that makes it correct for the therapeutic setup. So when we do a model-based posture alignment, on the left we have images of overlapped heads before alignment. So you can say on the top, it is the blue one is today's position, and the red one is how he was positioned during the planning stage. So they have a small rotation, a small deformation, significant enough to cause a problem in the radiation visualization. So once you do after, basically use the biomechanical model to align, they both starts to overlap, and that gives you a better way of understanding, where the anatomy is as of today. And how accurate are these? So we then did the study where for 10 patients, we acquired onboard imaging that shows onboard CT imaging after they are positioned every day, and they compared with what the biomechanical correction was actually giving, and we use cross correlation as a way to say how accurate it is. From a cross correlation perspective, anything about 0.8 is considered to be clinically applicable, and most of the numbers we can see are within 0.9 to 1 being perfect answer. And we also looked into individual organs at risk. So for example, not only the tumor, but we also look into the left parotid gland, the right parotid gland. How are they moving? Where are they today? How are they, where are they today according to the daily imaging versus where are they today according to the biomechanical model, and how well they overlap. And all these studies were done that shows that using biomechanical models, we can deform the anatomy so that we get exactly the position that the patient is today. And that will enable the very critical information. Now, in the case of lungs, we are now jumping from the head and neck that we were looking into, and we are going into a scenario where we are looking into lungs. Lungs is interesting because it is not an anatomy that is in one position and that's pretty much it. It is an anatomy that constantly keeps deforming back and forth. And what that means is we need to account for its dynamics also. The rib cages constantly expand, the diaphragm constantly moves down. And for patients who have additional complications, right? So we can have details of how the tissue gets, basically affected by other complications such as emphysema, COPD, and even in the case of COVID, it has been very widely known as to how you have the ground glass artifact that affects the entire alveolar system quite well. So all those details needs to be accounted when we show the visualization, and that becomes a very critical issue. Now, previously we saw this simple image where we overlap the anatomy, but when we look into the anatomy, it works in synchronous with also other soft tissues. So here we have one of the lungs, and we have the liver in the bottom, and the lung and liver are working together towards the whole breathing process. The lung is expanding and contracting, and that deforms not only the lung but also the liver. The liver is also going up and down, and liver being a soft tissue, it is also going through soft tissue deformations. And all these needs to be accounted so that we can clearly say where the patient is, where the liver is for the patient on that day. And here we are seeing force maps, colored in blue and red, and that basically explanatorily shows how these deformations constantly happen. So one of the additional imaging that we employed is called as a 4D CT. 4D CT is conventionally acquired at UCLA, but they are not used directly for planning. They are used mainly for finding out how much the tumor moves. Is it a tumor stable tumor, or is it just moving all over the place? So it is considered as an additional imaging. From the 4D CT, we look into what kind of deformations are actually happening. And we employ what is called as an inverse elasticity measurement, where we measure for every voxel what is the corresponding elasticity that we actually have, and whether it is even matching the input data or not. And when you combine all those data, we get different aspects. One is the estimated elasticity, that tells you what is the elasticity for each voxel. That is ventilation, or basically the voxel by voxel expansion and contraction that happens during the system. And this is a deductive information that we can overlap onto the lung visualization itself. Why is this important? Because when you have a normal patient, you can look into the elasticity distribution, that most of the voxels are about 8 to 10, 12 kilopascal range. But what we found out is when we have COPD, or when we have air trapped inside emphysema patients and so on, you have regions where the elasticity is close to 0 to 2. Those are indicative of air being trapped, and basically the tissue being not functionally performing well. And so every patient has their own distribution of elasticity that indicates what is going on underlying, and how accurate are these. And we did an entire paper to show that we can look into different classes of COPD damage. They are now given by gold standards, gold 0 being no damage, and gold 4 being severe COPD damage. And for each of these standards, we can see that as we go from one end to the another, the range of elasticity values where it's just air trapped and damaged tissue starts to go higher and higher. And all these are additional informations that gives more detail in terms of what the patient is actually going through. And this is why it is very important from a visualization perspective to see all these details. Well, we also have to look into how accurate these details are. Image artifacts can cause a lot of havoc in these calculations. So we have to give specific focus on making sure, well, we think the elasticity is this, but we are only sure by this much, or we are only confident about it by a certain level. And so a validation becomes a big detail. So most of the time when the imaging quality is good, the biomechanical model is able to represent what is actually happening inside the patient quite accurately. And the ground truth elasticity has a lot of confidence in terms of saying what that particular voxel elasticity by itself is. And we have to collect these data once in a while to figure out, is this data even changing in the patient? When you go, since the patient is going to get treated for like 30, 35 days, the elasticity detail may vary from one day to another to another. Can we even track it so that we can find out how accurately these boxes are moving? So we took specific scenarios where there was no change and we were not expecting any changes, and we consistently did multiple images on the same patient different days, and we can find out that the elasticity can be consistently measured for that specific patient. So the deductive information is consistent, and it gives the added information that we are indicating regions where there is additional damage in addition to the tumor that is getting treated. So all these visualizations are very critical. So given the time, I'd like to conclude that VAR systems has many clinical applications in a clinical setup. So the input data becomes a big deal. Patient safety is going to be a major issue before VAR gets into a therapeutic setup. We need to make sure that whatever visualization is shown has sub-millimeter accuracy or even close to a millimeter accuracy, so that the clinician can rely on what he is seeing. 3D visualization of recorded information is very critical, so that it enables the surgeons to go back into the treatment room and say what has actually happened. If we missed something, is there a specific event that happened that we did not catch? And that can be visualized only in VAR systems. And potential in-room collisions can always happen. Something, patients are positioned wrongly, the wrong table, the wrong patient, the wrong site, instead of treating the left lung, the right lung. All those scenarios needs to be precisely captured, and visualized so that we don't, those events can be avoided and reviewed. Indication of unusual events, and that is also critical. And integration of patient information is going to be a very important task for VAR systems to be used in a regular basis. So biomechanical models are going to play a very important role so that they can integrate the imaging that was acquired on day 1, take it all the way up to day 2, day 3, all the way up to day 30, and come up with the entire storyline. So I'd like to conclude the talk with all the funding agencies that have been very supportive of us. Ken and Wendy Ruby Foundation has been supporting our biomechanical modeling work for the last 10 years. Peter Bing has provided a lot of support for treatment space imaging at our places. NIH has been nice to support the work. Varian has worked with us very closely in making sure the cameras are tracking the gantry movements, and we come up with enough GPU based calculations and so on. And we are currently supported by TRDRP, which is a California project for COPD tracking, and we have a lot of focus on how do we better treat COPD patients, and that's kind of where we are. Thank you, and I think that's all I got.
And thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk. And I see that our real host is here, so I'll pass it on to her to manage the rest of the session, Jenny.
Hi, how are you? So nice to see the work, like from this small project we started with, unbelievable, getting lung dynamics, physically model lung dynamics to how much work has been applied here. So we'll open the floor for questions.
Okay. I'll leave it to this.
And let's see, I need to, so I'm going to get things started a little bit here, Anand. So when you talk about getting the ground truth for the lungs,
yeah,
how do you get ground truth in people?
Right. So there are many imaging protocols. The one that we use is called as a 5D imaging protocol that acquires the patient image using something called as a free breathing scan, where the patient is not holding a breath or anything. He just breathes normally. There are multiple sensors in the body that tracks how much his chest is moving, how much his diaphragm is moving, and it looks for all those data sets. And we acquired multiple scans. I think the clinical protocol right now uses 25 scans, 25 free breathing scans, low dose scans. And with these 25 scans, we first come up with what is called as a 5D model that looks into what the voxel does statistically in terms of changes in the amplitude, changes in the airflow, and so on. So there are multiple factors that comes into play, and we mark all those things. And to do that, we need to do a deformable image registration, one of the key tasks that we do. So, and from our group, there are multiple algorithms that we have looked into. The clinical version uses an algorithm called BEADS, which is basically a B-spline based system where you take 2 images at 2 splines and you warp the spline so that, and you also look into where the Hounsfield intensity values are, and we very closely match it to see how the deformation actually happens. So so if we were to look something into this, the ground truth in this case is coming from where these the deformation vectors are actually moving, and there are different constraints that comes into play. We have the clinical version uses an inverse consistent B-spline version, quite stable, and we constantly look into other algorithms, how can we improve, and so on. So we know that the ground truth validation accuracy is sub-millimeter accuracy. It's about 1 to 2 millimeter at best, severely worst cases, but for most patients it is within 1 millimeter. And so that's how we get the ground truth deformation.
And how do you go to from that to elasticity? What are the assumptions? Don't you need like tissue properties for that?
Right. So, I mean, that's, basically the storyline. So what we do is we first take the geometry that we have that is representative of the breathing at the rest state. So when you say the breathing rest state, that means that's the end exhalation. When you have taken a normal breathing, you finished the breathing, and that's the volume that we start with. That's your geometry. And we take the geometry for every voxel. We go back into the 5D data and look into the deformation vector fields and find out where these vector fields are going when you go from end exhalation to end inhalation. So, what is the vector trajectory for every voxel? And once you have it, and then we go back from the geometry, we assemble a finite element lung model. So every voxel is now a finite element, so it's a very high resolution biomechanical model. And now the basic constraint that we apply is that the lung deformation basically happens because of the motion of the diaphragm and the rib cage. So we take the diaphragm, the rib cage as the boundary conditions, and we get those boundary conditions directly from the imaging itself, because those are easier things to capture. The internal is much more complicated. So once we get the boundary conditions, the assumption is there exists a unique elasticity that will exactly replicate the deformation that is happening, that is currently being seen in the deformation vector fields. And can we find out that particular elasticity for each voxel? And to do that, so we go through this iterative process where we start by initially coming up with an initial elasticity estimation, and we start with that. It comes up with whatever deformation we see, and we look into convergence criteria, where our convergence criteria is every voxel needs to match the ground truth by within 1 millimeter accuracy. So with that constraint, we keep continuously rerunning it. We use a gradient descent based optimization for every voxel. So every voxel has its own optimization parallelly happening continuously. And once that optimization finishes, it takes a long time. The optimization runs somewhere close to 2 days for the entire run. And in fact, that's using GPUs, by the way. And so it runs a long time, and after the whole process, you would see that it would have converged quite well. And we will move, for the most cases, we find out, what is the close enough elasticity that can exactly mimic that particular behavior that we are observing in the ground truth. So the basic assumption constraints that we have is rib cage and diaphragm. If we get those motions, and there is a specific boundary condition that we apply, that's it. And we have repeated these process for like shallow breathing, deep breathing, all those conditions, and it has worked quite well. And it has worked to a point where some recent studies, we are seeing that the model guided displacements are much more accurate than ground truth displacements, because sometimes ground truth gets smudged because of image artifacts and other issues. And the model says, well, the physics says this is not supposed to happen. It's not going to happen. So it sticks to the physics. So that's really helpful in some cases, actually.
Unless other people maybe bring some questions up, or students who may have questions about your career path also as well.
Sure. By the way, I never met Sundar Pichai.
You never mentioned what?
I never met Sundar Pichai. In a sense that he was my school senior, but we never met. I think you probably missed the earliest stage. I was telling that we went to the same school.
Maybe I'll follow up with that question while waiting for others. So, I also wanted to understand how you get the ground truth, because we are also working on elasticity imaging in ultrasound and MR elastography. And for real images, I think, this is an issue. And we do phantom-based experiments, etc. But for the real imaging case, this has been an issue that we have been thinking about as well.
Yes, ground truth is always a problem. I totally agree. And we call it a ground truth for all practical purpose. We assume it is ground truth because we have a graduate student right now. She's sitting down and tracking every point manually to find out where these points are actually moving. Dr. Lowe has had multiple PhDs before who has done these kinds of data sets. where someone literally clicks points, like 300 points that are, it's just moving all over the place, and track them from one to another so that we can verify whether these ground truth are even ground truth.
Yeah.
And even within that, there are, there are multiple studies that you can look into. There is one study that is called Empire 10, and they have a lot of landmark data sets available for ground truth verifications. So, and these are, again, someone sat down and clicked through the points. So there are data sets that are 300 landmarks. There are data sets that are 1,200 landmarks. And there is a lot of inter-subject variation here. If we have worked with Selena and Milinska way back on saying, every observer has a different way of saying what is ground truth.
Yeah.
And that you can definitely see on these data sets. So you can look into a data set point, and multiple observers would have given a different answer, and that answer would be differing by like 1 to 1.5 millimeters all the time. So these are some of the data sets that are commonly used. If Mikai community always has been coming up with these data challenges. I think last year they came up with the brain landmarking challenge, and these data sets are very useful for looking into what is ground truth and how it is clinically useful.
Thank you.
What sounds difficult is that you have the force from the air coming in, so you would need to know exactly that. But if the air doesn't get somewhere, then you don't have that force. And then they have the tissue property, like how healthy they are or not, and that may also differ per patient. Sounds really, really complicated.
Yes, and that's why I said the optimization takes into account of a lot of parameters. We have we built a cluster. We have about 48 GPUs, and for computing people, that's about 330 teraflops, and that runs for 2 days continuously to finish one patient. So it looks into all possible combinations as to what is actually happening. Airflow is a major factor. When we take like normal breathing, the airflow is very laminar, so it's very smooth. But when we take deep breathing, it's called as a residual volume and tidal lung volume. So RVC is tidal lung control. And those ends, there are deep breaths, and you can see that the airflow has a major impact. And you can see that the air is filling up, and we have to take into account of the whole compliance itself. So there are two components to it, and what we mostly see is a static lung compliance. In a sense, it's sort of a steady state answer of what the ground truth elasticity is. And there's also a dynamic lung compliance, which is sort of a hyperelastic parameter, where every walk source elasticity may go a little further to accommodate for more air that is actually coming in, and the hyperelastic behavior is also happening. And in some cases, we have closely monitored how this can lead to even tissue damage. In some cases, we have seen that by following up with patients, and when the patient take more and more deeper breaths, it starts to affect the local elasticity. You could see the local damage that is actually happening. And so there is a very involved model that is actually under the hood that is happening.
Maybe we have some questions from some students or anybody.
I have two quick questions. The first one is just following up the previous question for lung elastography. Is there any work has been done for noise and error modeling? Because as I know, in this kind of approach, the Gaussian Newton-based approach, noise is a very challenging issue. I'd like to know how you answer this issue.
Right. So noise and something called as deblurring are two issues that are taken seriously in the lung domain. The noise, as you say, is a big deal, especially because the lung has a lot of air, and depending upon how much radiation dose that is there during imaging, the air may be characterized quite well. Theoretically, CT is considered to be quantitative, but calibration of the CT could, small variations can make the scale go this way and that way. And so when the imaging dose starts to go lower and lower, you can see that the noise starts to go higher and higher. So noise is definitely a big issue for lung imaging. So that's a big issue for diagnostic imaging versus therapeutic imaging. So if we look into the diagnostic imaging, the FDA claims that the convention should be that the total dose needs to be less than 7.8 millisieverts, which is pretty low. And in that dose setup, we cannot acquire good quality image. And that, it could be useful for indicative purposes, like even if the patient has ground glass artifacts, or if the patient has a tumor. For all those indicative events, it's a very good thing. But when it comes to therapeutic, we cannot use the same data sets. That becomes a problem. So when it goes to therapeutic scenarios, the patient during the radiotherapy gets like several, 10 times of dose as that of a diagnostic CT scanner. So the dose becomes almost a no issue because anyway, he's getting a lot of dose. So that gives us the clinic the ability to increase the dose so that they can better characterize the local tumor, the local surrounding tissue, keep the noise low, and so on. At UCLA, I think the current protocol for the 5D imaging, I think it's about somewhere close to 25 to 28 millisieverts. And that is, based on, calculations that we have done so far. And that that enables us to make sure that the image dose remains high enough that the noise goes down low enough. And that helps a lot. But keep in mind that the anatomy is also a moving anatomy. So there is also a blurring artifact that actually happens. So in a sense that the tissue is constantly moving, the scanner is moving. Sometimes you can see a blood vessel that is just getting warped unnecessarily just because the anatomy is actually moving. So the only way to fix it is to do a free breathing scan where the scanner goes really fast and it doesn't acquire the image once, but it acquires it multiple times. And when you acquire multiple times at different breathing stages, at one of those stages, you will get a clear view of that particular anatomy. So in a sense that when the patient is breathing normally, when the patient is at the end of the exhalation, when the anatomy is much more settled down, you would get a better picture of these blood vessels. And most of the deblurring happens closer to the diaphragm because the diaphragm is the one that moves a lot. And deblurring happens a lot, blurring happens a lot around the diaphragm. So we look into 25 different images and 25 different breathing stages to figure out which one has a more stable view of the blood vessels and the process. So the whole process is called deblurring, where someone carefully sits and verifies, and the 5D model by itself is basically fine-tuned to do that, make sure the anatomy is deeper. So those are two issues that are very important. So I have a graduate student who is specifically looking into see, can we use diagnostic dose in a therapeutic setup? The reason is, although we get really nice data from the therapeutic setup, when we move to other surgical procedures like lobectomy, lung volume reduction surgery, and so on, they are not able to afford the same radiation dose as what the radiation therapy can afford. So one of the key tasks that we have is to see, can we lower the imaging dose? That obviously increases the noise. So there is a machine learning component that kicks into play to make sure it can compensate for some of the noise. And once the noise goes down, the theory is that we will get the same accuracy in all these measurements. And that helps us to account for movements and deblurring and so on. And eventually we can transition these measurements from radiotherapy into other domains also.
So you mean that your proposed deep learning based approach act just as a denoising, or also it tries to learn the physical model parameters to correct any artifacts regarding the movement?
Right now it's open. You can do both, honestly. The deblurring, basically a denoising using machine learning is a very straightforward, simple thing. But provided you have the correct ground truth data. So if we have the ground truth data, for example, what we did is we did a study where we had the imaging acquired at different MAS tube currents from the CT scan. And it's the same lung anatomy, but one is acquired at 40 MAS, then to 20 MAS, then to 10 MAS, and 5 MAS, and 2 MAS, and so on. And then we look into how these imaging or noise is cropping up. And that gives you the ground truth data to say, given a noisy image, can I denoise it? And what is my supervised learning data? And that's a perfect study. That's a very straightforward study that we can actually do. A much more complicated study is the latter one, where we look into how this anatomy is moving, and can we even use it using machine learning, study the behavior so that the denoising can be better performed. So both the approaches are there. The first one is rather straightforward, I think.
Okay, thank you. My second question is a more general one. Has any work been done about optimizing the whole imaging system for your 3D visualization of recorded information? Because it seems that the computation is high. So what are your suggestions in terms of maybe the number of the cameras or the number of frames per second to optimize the whole imaging system?
Right. So when you say imaging, you're talking about the 3D camera system, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So that's where the application kicks in. So we work closely with the UCLA hospital to find out what frame rate that they would like to see. So every application, every scenario has a different frame rate requirement. So when it is when a recording happens purely for legal purposes, like if the doctor wants to know, I didn't do a bad job, if something happened, all those tasks are there. When the clinician wants to know what happened inside the room, then they are okay with 1 second per frame kind of a rate. So in a sense, every second we generate a 3D map of the treatment room, and that's good enough for now. But when it comes to collision, when it comes to figuring out if something is getting pretty close to the head, if something is getting pretty close to colliding with the patient, there are several scenarios where events happen that slowly happen at the outside, but by the time it gets closer to the patient, it's very quick. So we at those scenarios, we have been asked to do at least 10 frames per second. So we have to work with these two modalities. So what we did is we have a switch on, switch off philosophy. Whenever we have a complicated scenario, we have a 10-second per frame acquisition that acquires a lot and then writes it slowly, because it's also a lot of data to write into memory. So we also have to worry about it from a system perspective, and or a short burst, it can do a lot of tracking. So we use an AI algorithm that tracks objects in the periphery, and once it knows the trajectory as to where it's getting, and when the trajectory starts to meet, and we have these burst mode where we acquire a lot of frames real quick and also alert the therapist that something is happening. So the frame rate, there is no specific norm. It purely depends upon which application for the hospital.
Great, thank you.
Cool.
Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. I also work with Dr. Roland, so good to hear from one of her former students. With regards to, wanted to learn a little bit more about deviation, handling models for patients whose anatomy deviates significantly from the norm. So for example, I had a friend in high school whose heart was on the other side of her body. My mom's appendix was like 6 inches higher than normal. Or like I know people have like parts of their lungs removed for surgery, stuff like that. How do you account for that, and how much more effort does that take into building a patient-specific model for those really significant deviations from the norm?
Well, it's actually already taken care of. So if we look into the way we actually build the biomechanical model, we go through these steps where a clinician takes the CT scan, wherever that is, and his main task for a physicist is to sit down and contour individual structures. This takes like hours. for some worst case scenarios. And he sits down, but if the heart has moved, it's on the right, left side or the right side, it is his task to sit down and slowly do the contouring and know, okay, this is where the anatomy is. And once the contouring is done, the model is automatically assembled and it automatically starts to come up with these finite element models that are for individual structures, and it assembles automatically. So any variation in the patient is already taken care of, and that's the whole point of doing a patient specific biomechanical model. So that's why we call it as an avatar, because whichever one you want to do it, even if it's a child, the same thing happens. So there is no atlas based work here. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. So then is there possibility on the other side of that, making it faster or more optimized for less deviation from what could be considered a norm?
Yes. So there is a proposal, or there is a project that we are doing right now where we are looking into the range of motions that are observed in patients, and that because we have the ability to monitor patients for 35 days, how they move, how their daily positions are, how their internal constituents are, and so on. So we have a project where we are looking into how these vectors are commonly moving, and whenever they deviate, what is the cue, and when do they start deviate, and once it starts to deviate, it starts to have its own trajectory path, and can we even model it? So we have a machine learning framework that looks into possible possible deviation that it may happen. And once it sees something unique that actually happens, it starts to recalibrate and starts to observe closely as to what is happening, and comes up with a newer machine learning model that tells you, okay, that has a new trajectory and it's going in a different direction. So a good example is, if we were to have someone, say a 75-year-old getting treated, hypothetically, uh, during the treatment, he may have a lot of fat loss. So that means his body weight is just going down by 30 pounds or 40 pounds within a month. So that's a lot of water loss. So his body would start to shrink quite a bit. You can see the neck muscles going down, facial muscles, or all the stuffy face that we have, everything starts to vanish and it starts to go thinner and thinner. And that may not happen for a 40-year-old, or that may not happen for even like a 30-year-old who has a different, same head and neck cancer. And similarly, for if you look into HPV patients who head and who get throat cancer, HPV for the head and neck is supposed to respond quite well, which is a good news. So what that means is that the tumor starts to shrink very fast during the treatment. And that may not happen for other head and neck cancers, but for just for HPV based cancer. So when the tumor starts to shrink quite a bit, as per the simulations, you would see that other organs and other glands are moving inside the anatomy quite fast. So you may have, parotids in position one day, and then it starts to move the next day, the next day, the next day, next day. So you need to worry about all those things. So every patient has his own trajectory. So, we have to make sure we track those trajectories and optimize, how do we come up with machine learning that would be specifically focused on identifying those scenarios.
Anybody else?
Maybe just a quick question. So you mentioned a few times that you do the organ contouring by hand.
I know.
I assume that's because you don't have reliable enough segmentation methods for multiple organs.
Well, we can say yes with a caution, but the main thing is there are softwares that do automatic contouring, but the clinician, because it doesn't always give you the necessary accuracy, they anyway have to go back and sit down, go through it frame by frame and clean it up. So in a sense that, for example, a head and neck, there are softwares that do auto contouring that can contour a brain easily, that can contour rib cages and spine easily. But if it comes to sensitive organs like a parotid gland, it has to be a clinician who has to sit down and closely monitor and contour it. So that is unfortunately no way out, because the patient's life is on the line. So it's, the time is well spent. Even for scenarios like the prostate and bladder, auto contouring are not very accurate. And these are very sensitive organs. So it is definitely time well spent.
Thank you.
Anyone else? So Anna, let me ask you something. So, you came with a background in computer science, and you had to do all this work in a very, very stressful environment, I would say, with people's lives at stake here. So how did you manage, a little bit of the answer to that, but I haven't seen work with you for a long time now. Learning about physiology and biomechanics, and kind of how does that work? Like when you come from one discipline and you're kind of working on this very multidisciplinary environment, and all the, I'm sure the medical is kind of from the daily interaction that you kind of figure it out, what's important, but.
Right. So that's a pretty good question. So from a graduate student perspective, even as a faculty perspective, it is a very hard thing to actually keep track of different events that are happening. So in a sense that, what you're working in my domain, we need to know both about what is actually happening in the radiation, the physics behind the particle moving inside the body, starting from that to the anatomy, what are the different structures, what are the different organs, how do they move? And so there's a lot of anatomy involved. On top of it, you need to come up with a computer science based implementation of whatever that is, like a finite element model. You need to program it. So you need to both to know the programming domain as well as the anatomy domain as well as the physics domain. So the learning curve has been quite steep, to be honest, but it has been very interesting. So I think that's where the passion kicks in. So earlier, I said that when I started working on GPUs, I was mostly doing color coding and making sure the images look better. High dynamic range images. It was a good problem, but I had no passion for it for the same reason. Because a lot of people say that men has a problem with colors because we don't know if it's a light violet or a dark violet. Right? So passion is the main thing that graduate students need, in my view. And if they are passionate enough about what they do, the steepness of the curve would not be a big problem. That doesn't devalidate the steepness of the curve also. You still have to go through the curve of knowing all these domains. And we have the scenario where we have to keep learning every day. In terms of computer science, both in terms of the radiation physics, because the equipments keep changing all the time, and anatomical modeling. There's a lot of physics that goes into it in terms of plasticity and so on. Image processing algorithms, now machine learning also. So the domain keeps changing, and so the one thing that has helped me so far is ability to read papers and books a lot. I think or this is mainly for graduate students, and as long as they stick to reading 1 or 2 hours a day about the anatomy blindly, just to know what is actually happening, and that really helps them on a longer way. So if anybody is working on skin imaging, you guys do a lot of skin imaging, and that's a very good problem. And there is a lot of details in terms of how the skin cells behave, why those cells do what they do, and what are the different glands and so on. And it's definitely a good habit to read it. I wouldn't say start with the biggest book and start with it, but you can start with initial, like a very simple books. I started with something called as Respiratory Essentials by West. He wrote this book in 1968 or 1970. That has been one of the best books I have ever read. And he was explaining a lot of things in very simple mechanism. And books like those are really helpful for graduate students so that they can understand the domain and go from there.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
that's one thing. The funding is another important aspect. I mean, we have been lucky in receiving a lot of funds to support our work. So that's one good thing. So it is important to know how to write a grant, when you are in a graduate school itself, so that it slowly gives you the ability to know what is, important when you go out. I mean, if you're looking into an academic career, it is very important that you know how to write grants. I was lucky enough, if you remember, I used to work with you all the time when you were I was a graduate student for you. And once I got into MD Anderson, they always focus on writing grants, and usually it's a monster in writing grants. And we write like 8 to 10 grants a year, just getting things done, keep pushing it constantly. And also, one important habit that really helps is to look into NIH Reporter in your domain to see what was the latest grant funded. And I think that's a great thing to actually do. I mean, we found out the hard way, but NIH has its view on what is the hot thing, and sometimes we perceive things that are slightly off. We may think that it is the best thing to do, but NIH may have a different view, and it's always important to figure out, are we in line with NIH or are we in a different line? In which case, it's better to not go there, but try to do something else. But looking into NIH Reporter, if anybody is working on elastography, please look into NIH Reporter, and you can look into a log of all the different grants that has been funded there. And that gives you a very good, and all these grants also have a very general view of what the grant does. And that gives you a lot of motivation as to what you can do.
Thank you.
That's helpful.
And I don't know the timing, Mujad, but you know what the timing is, so I'm not sure. I think I was off to start with, so.
We are over time, so we can.
Okay, all right.
If there are any more questions, we can finish, I think. And also let me thank Anand. This was fascinating, both the technical contents and as well as all the insights. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Anand, for sharing with us.
Yeah, it has been an interesting 20 years.
Okay, so I think with this, I think we're going to end the session if there's no more questions. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and enjoy the rest of the semester.
All right. Have a good week. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.